Hello, Jennifer.
Hi, Sean.
How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you doing?
One day at a time. We're
Yeah,
doing all right. Yep.
yeah. So we're coming to you from our respective homes. I'm in Lafayette, Colorado. My name is Jennifer Ho,
And I'm in Denver, Colorado. My name is Sean O'Neill.
and we are the co-instructors of Antiracism 1. And just a little bit about me. I am a new transplant to the state of Colorado. I just moved here in August 2019, and I am a professor of ethnic studies at the University of Colorado Boulder.
I also work at University of Colorado Boulder. I am a fourth year PhD candidate in the Ethnic Studies Department, and I've been in Denver since June of 2009. So about 11 years now, a little over 11 years now. So.
Okay. I should ask you for lots of recommendations, Sean, since I'm a new transplant. So we're here because we've created this 3-week course on anti-racism, and we're titling it Anti-Racism 1 because the hope is that there will be an Anti-Racism 2 and an Anti-Racism 3. And what we're here to demonstrate for you are 2 of the assignments related to week 1 and week 3. So Sean and I are just getting to know each other. I think this, we've only spoken really a handful of times, and we've really never had a race conversation, right? We've really never deliberately sat down and talked about race. So that's what we're going to do, which is, if you're looking ahead to week 3, that's an assignment for you to do in week 3. So we're going to demonstrate how to have a race conversation that is friendly and easy, and will also, I think, be helpful to you as you're doing the reading and the assignments. And the topic of what we're talking about is the assignment for week 1, which is to answer the question, what race are you? Like, what is your racial identification? And then the second part is, how did you learn that you were the race that you were? Okay. So do you mind if I begin, Sean? Can I ask you? So my first question
Please.
to you is, what race do you identify with?
What race do I identify with? Wow, that is it's such a packed question, particularly, of knowing what I know now, that, race is a social construct. And so that I also realize that when we're talking about race, what we're really talking about is cultural aspects and cultural foundations. Race, whether it's black race, white race, so on and so forth. I mean, those are terms created by the colonizers and by those enacting the enslavement of folk of Africana descent in this country. I've always identified as black. However, that has shifted over the years, as and I'll speak for my communities. We're always having to sort of go back in and shift how we want to be identified and the terminology around that. So yeah, I do consider myself black, the black race, which that's shifted over the years. Afro-American, African-American, Black American. The term I go by now, this day and age, is a person of African descent or a person of Africana descent, being that my direct genealogy, of course, is traced back to Africa.
Thank you. That was it's so helpful to really kind of contextualize the complexity of this question, right? So then my follow-up question for you is, how did you figure this out, right? Like, how did you learn that you were the race that you identify? And you can either kind of think about like in your earliest days, or if you want to kind of talk through now the way that you identify. Either answer is great.
Well, I'll go back to my earlier days. Black families of Africana descent, particularly in America, at least from my experience, have always discussed race. So race has been a discussion going on in my family as far back as I could remember, and as far back as I can actually dictate the speech of what my elders were saying to me. I think one of the first moments where I really, really realized my racial positionality in this country, I could have been more than 6 or 7, and my mother and my grandmother sat me down to basically explain who I was and what that meant in the broader aspects of American society. And what they told me is that I was living in a country or in a society that was not designed for me. And that it was very important that they understood that. And they were very careful about how they explained that to me. My mother and I have gone back and talked about this conversation many times because it really impacted my life. And what they told me is that I operated in a society that was meant to either see me dead or on drugs or in prison by the time I was 18 or 19 years old. And that because of that, there were going to be many choices that I was going to have to be able to dictate. Now, they as women, what they told me is that all we can do is guide you and give you the right paths to go down, but the decision is going to ultimately be yours. And that you're going to have to make those decisions, or whatever decisions you make, you're going to have to live with that. Mm. And it was really, really eye-opening, but that in concert with many other discussions that my family have always had. So I've always known that, you know, I am a Black person. I am an African person. I am an African-American person. I mean, whether it was my uncles, my aunts, we talked about that in many ways. When we talked about our culture, I would say 90% of our conversations were surrounded about these particular topics day in and day out. Mm-hmm. There was no way around it. And that's the importance of what we're getting at here with this course, and particularly because when we talk about white privilege, the fact that whiteness doesn't ever have to be discussed because of the normalization of it, but thinking about other ethnicities, other races operating in these societies, that many of us have to engage with this stuff all the time. Mm-hmm. So I have always known my race and what my race means to the larger components of society. I'm sorry that answer was a little long-winded, but there's really no way to.
This is great. I should also say for everyone watching, this is not scripted. You know, this is the first time I've ever asked Sean this question, so I'm going to ask a follow-up question, just one to keep this brief. It's a two-part follow-up question. So when you remember, if you can recall back to when you were 6 or 7, having this conversation, was your racial identification as Black contrasted with whiteness? So that's question number 1. And then number 2, how did you feel like after hearing your mother and your grandmother sit down and kind of explain what it meant for you to be Black? Do you recall any feelings that came up?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It was contrasted often, you know, because that Black-white binary was often always discussed within my family unit and the broader range of my family, that those comparisons were always made. So I always knew that there was something different about all of us, that we were sharing the same space. And again, I'll just talk about this country specifically, or talk about Chicago specifically from where I'm at, but that we were all separated by this skin color. And that skin color had a lot of other details within that. I was also made very aware of a very early age about the construction of chattel slavery in this country, and that we were still unpacking and dealing with emotionally and psychologically with the damaging effects of slavery, and that as a group, as a unit, as a community, that we all had to work on that together. The second part of your question was
the feelings. Did you have, do you recall any feelings that emerged?
Yeah, I remember a lot of feelings. Sometimes those feelings were of anger and a feeling that of the unfairness, often seeing the weight placed on my family as compared to maybe seeing another family at the grocery store. You know, the 1980s in particular was very, very eye-opening because Reaganomics, just almost destroyed the Black family unit, as other executive branches over the years had nearly brought us to our knees. But that was my first real memory of what it really meant to be Black in America and the disparities between Black and white. Because, I mean, Ronald Reagan almost killed us. I mean, he really brought my family to its knees, and we collectively pulled it together and made it through. But I mean, barely. It was a really, really difficult time. But it was at that moment, particularly during the 80s, with all the things that I was taught in the 70s really came into light.
Great. Thank you.
Absolutely. Now you.
Okay.
Same questions. I'm excited to hear this.
Okay. So do you want to ask me or should I just answer?
Yeah, just go for it.
So I currently identify as Asian American. That's actually the predominant way that I will answer the question, like what race I am, but it's also the predominant answer I give for any kind of form of identity question. And that's unusual because I think that really only 20% of people of Asian descent will say Asian American in the answer to the question, what are you? Or the answer to the question, like about how you identify either racially or ethnically. So I want to start there because my decision to identify as Asian American is very much rooted in my being an ethnic studies scholar and a critical race scholar. That in signaling the identity Asian American, what I'm trying to do is to say that I recognize the solidarity that I share with other people of Asian ancestry living in the United States. And I also share a commitment to social justice that the term Asian American came out of. And so the term Asian American was really a fairly new term. It was first coined in the 1960s, late 1960s, by two graduate students who were working on third world liberation movements and in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then it came to be used, as we now know, both as a sort of a census term, right? So people will check off on the census, whether you're Asian or on any kind of form, right? Really typical. But for people like me who study Asian American people, Asian American experiences, it's also a movement that bore an intellectual tradition of social justice. So this is how Asian American studies emerged out of the 1960s and 70s through coalition work with other ethnic studies movements, other civil rights movements, and then really saw itself with roots in social justice. So that's how I currently identify. But then, you know, to answer the question of like my first recognition of race was actually not through an identification with Asian American, but like you, a recognition that I wasn't white. So that's really interesting, right? That both of us kind of came into a consciousness of our kind of ethnic racial identities through knowing or understanding that we weren't white. And in my case, I don't know if it was, you know, I don't recall my parents ever sitting me down and explaining in the way that your grandmother and mother sat you down. But I remember being in a park, again, when I was around 6 or 7. So, you know, really interesting, right? When kids start to become aware of these kinds of social differences. And my father was flying a kite. And we were on kind of like a pitcher's mound. We were on like a baseball field in a local park. And so he was on a pitcher's mound and this young white kid. So I'm 6 or 7. So I think the kid's pretty old, but he might've only been like 10 or 11, or he might've been 17 or 18. Right. But he kept kind of like leaping toward, like he would be running and he kind of leaped towards my dad. So he did that 2 or 3 times. And my dad yelled at him and he was like, I know what you're doing. Right. And my dad, I could see my dad getting like super upset and flustered. And then he pulled in the kite and we walked home. And I asked my dad what was happening. And my dad said he was trying, so the kid had a switchblade and he was trying to cut the strings of the kite. Right.
Oh, wow.
And that's when I knew, even though my father didn't say anything, I thought, oh, this is because we're Chinese, right? Like that, I remember having that thought really clearly in my head. Like, I guess that's the first instance of maybe racism, if we want to call it that. Now, again, I want to be really clear, like, who knows what the motives were for this teenage boy to be trying to cut the strings of the kite that my dad is flying. It's hard not to think that it wasn't racially or ethnically motivated in some way, shape, or form. It's certainly
definitely microaggressive.
Yeah, it's certainly a terrible thing to do, right? No matter, like, it's certainly a really terrible thing to do to any family, right? To any father with a young child. But that's when I definitely had this sense like, oh, this is happening because we're not white. This is happening because we are a Chinese family. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's interesting. I mean, we share a lot of commonalities in that regard, which I'm not surprised at all. You know, I remember just what you're saying conjures up other memories of when I was first had to realize my race from outside of my family, and those are very painful moments. You know, I remember living next door to white neighbors in a predominantly black neighborhood, a neighborhood that became predominantly black. And one of the white neighbors called my Uncle Marvin the N-word. And my Uncle Marvin, you know, punched him out, you know, and we talk about that all the time of like, you know, those moments in our lives where we really had to sort of take forceful action and stand our ground, sometimes revolting in violent acts to stand our ground. You know, I also recall the first time I was called the N-word by a small white child, and the same thing. My family talks about this all the time because I came home crying and they were like, well, what happened? I told them what happened. And they're like, well, what did you do? And I was like, I did what I was taught to do. I punched him out, you know. Now, as a kid, I felt I can get away with that. As I got older, I realized that there's got to be another way. I can't go around punching people out, you know, because again, I'm operating in a white supremacist society that doesn't matter what someone else did to me. I'm the one who's going to take the brunt of persecution for that. So, but I guess what I'm saying is how difficult it has been when people such as you and myself and our families have been put in those situations, and how traumatic they are. And
how they really, you know, from a young age, how this really kind of stays with you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, this has been great as an initial conversation to have with you about race. I'm sure we're going to have many more conversations about race. And I hope for those of you watching, I hope you see like it's really easy. It's not difficult. In our case, it turns out that there were certain similarities. I think there's also really keen differences, which we don't have time to get into, but that are definitely worth exploring. Having a race conversation doesn't necessarily mean that you share the same story, but it means really listening, doing some deep listening, and being really respectful. So I think that we successfully modeled that.
I think that was great. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Sean. Okay. And we'll see all of you in the next video. So thanks for watching.